Women don't belong in war, and they sure as hell don't belong in my ring. Sergeant Brock Reynolds grabbed her by the collar, snatched her registration form off the table, and shoved her hard in front of 500 soldiers. The paper hit the floor. His boot came down on it. 230 pounds of decorated combat veteran, three-time champion, standing over a 24-year-old woman like she was nothing. She didn't stumble, didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. She just looked at him and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "You just made the worst decision of your career, Sergeant." 24 hours later, he was on the floor of that ring screaming his leg snapped clean, and she was already walking away. Before we go further, if this story hits you the way it hit me, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The bus pulled into Fort Hardin just after 7 in the morning, and Ava Carter was the last one off. Not because she was slow, not because she was hesitant. She was last because she'd spent the final 20 minutes of the ride sitting completely still, with her eyes closed, breathing slowly and deliberately, the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old, and terrified of her first junior competition in Mesa, Arizona. "Breathe like you already won," he used to say. "Not like you're hoping, like you already know." She stepped off that bus with a duffel bag over her left shoulder, a manila folder tucked under her right arm, and the kind of stillness that most people mistake for shyness. She was 24 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 143 pounds of disciplined, relentless, quietly devastating capability. She wore no rank insignia on her civilian clothes that morning, just dark cargo pants, a plain gray long-sleeve shirt, and worn but clean boots that had seen sand on 3 different continents. Fort Hardin, Texas was not the kind of place that made you feel welcome if you were unfamiliar with it. It was a sprawling, loud, sun-scorched installation that smelled like diesel and institutional coffee, and the particular kind of institutional ambition that collects in places where men compete for status. The annual Joint Forces Combat Showcase had been running for 11 years. It drew competitors from every branch: Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and it was known, quietly and without any official acknowledgement, as the place where reputations were made or broken. The registration tent was set up on the west end of the athletic complex, a big canvas structure with folding tables and fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly in the morning heat. Ava stepped inside, joined the line, and waited. She didn't look around with the eagerness of someone trying to assess competition. She just stood, relaxed, present. The soldier ahead of her finished his paperwork and moved on, and she stepped up to the table where a young specialist was sorting through folders. "Name," the specialist asked without looking up. "Carter, Ava Carter, Navy, hand-to-hand bracket." The specialist's fingers stopped moving for just a fraction of a second. He looked up, took her in, then looked back down and began searching through his stack of forms. Date of birth and unit. She gave him both. He found her pre-registration, started pulling the confirmation form, and that was the exact moment that the air in the tent changed. It changed because of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and belonging to someone who had learned over years of being the largest and loudest man in any room, that the sound of your own approach could be a weapon. Sergeant First Class Brock Reynolds walked through that tent the way a storm front moves across open Texas sky, not hurrying, not stopping, just advancing with the full expectation that everything in its path would get out of the way. He was 6'2" and 230 pounds of muscle that had been forged in combat deployments and sharpened by 11 years of competitive fighting. He had won the hand-to-hand bracket at Fort Hardin 3 years in a row. 3 consecutive years. He had a face that had been rearranged by other men's fists and had come out looking more settled for it, not less. A jaw like poured concrete, eyes that had the flat, assessing quality of a man who categorized everything he saw into either threat or non-threat and had become very comfortable with both categories. He was walking to the water station at the back of the tent when he passed behind Ava and glanced at the registration table and saw the name being written on the form. He stopped. "Carter," he said, not a question, a statement that was really a challenge wearing the clothes of a statement. Ava turned. She looked at him without alarm, without particular interest, the way you might look at someone who spoke your name in a crowded airport. "That's right," she said. Reynolds looked her up and down with the particular slowness of someone who wants you to know they're doing it. He let the silence sit. Then he made a sound, not quite a laugh, something lower and more dismissive than a laugh. Navy, he said, reading upside down off the form, hand-to-hand bracket. He said it the way you'd read a child's drawing and try to figure out what it was supposed to be. Correct on both counts, Ava said. How old are you? Old enough to register without your permission, Sergeant. Reynolds tilted his head slightly. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, yet more like interest. The way a cat's attention sharpens when something moves unexpectedly. You know who I am, he asked. Three-time winner, SFC Reynolds. You're from the 4th Infantry. You favor your right side, but you've been compensating for a left shoulder strain for about 2 years based on the way you're standing right now. She paused. Yes, I know who you are. The specialist at the table had stopped moving entirely. He was looking at his own paperwork with the studied intensity of a man who desperately did not want to be part of whatever was about to happen. Reynolds took one step closer, not threatening enough to constitute anything actionable, just close enough to use his size the way he'd used it his whole life as a reminder. Let me give you some friendly advice, he said quietly. His voice had dropped, which somehow made it worse. This isn't a SEAL training exercise. This isn't a controlled environment where your instructors are watching out for you. This is a real bracket with real soldiers, and the men in it have been training their entire careers for this specific kind of competition. I appreciate the briefing, Ava said. I'm not done. He let that land. You seem like a smart girl. Smart girls know when something isn't built for them. Smart girls, Ava said, also know when someone is scared. The air in the tent went very still. Reynolds stared at her. His jaw worked slightly like he was chewing on a response and finding it didn't taste right. Then he reached out, picked up her registration form from the table and tore it in half. Let it fall, crossed his arms. Women don't belong in war, he said. Full volume now, not the quiet voice, the performance voice, the voice designed to carry. And they sure as hell don't belong in my bracket. Ava looked at the pieces on the ground. She looked at them for exactly 2 seconds. Then she crouched, gathered every piece, stood up, placed them precisely on the table in front of the specialist and said 4 words. I'm a Navy SEAL. Then she turned back to the specialist. I'll need a new form. The specialist was already reaching for one. Reynolds stood there for a long moment. Then he made that sound again, the non-laugh, and walked away, and the tent breathed again. Standing at the side entrance, a woman in Army service dress watched the whole thing without moving. Staff Sergeant Command, Sergeant Major Diana Okafor, was 51 years old, and she had been in the Army for 28 of those years, and she had an instinct for recognizing 2 kinds of moments, the kind that pass and are forgotten, and the kind that become stories people are still telling 15 years later. This was the second kind. She watched Reynolds walk out of the tent. She watched Ava fill out her new form with a steady hand. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to 2 people, one to a colleague, which said only, watch the Navy entry in hand-to-hand, and one to her own daughter, which said, something interesting is happening today. Ava handed in her form, received her bracket assignment, and walked out into the Texas morning sun. She had 6 hours before her first match. She spent the first of them stretching. Not in the main gym where competitors gathered to perform their confidence for each other, but in a smaller auxiliary space at the far end of the complex that nobody was using because the air conditioning was out. She didn't mind the heat. She grew up in Arizona. Heat was familiar. Heat was almost comfortable. She stretched methodically. Hip flexors, hamstrings, shoulders, neck. She moved through each position with the focused attention of someone not warming up their body, but having a conversation with it, checking in. Are you ready? What do you need? What are you telling me? Her body had been through a great deal in 24 years. More than most bodies twice its age. She had fractured her left wrist in training 18 months ago and spent 6 weeks learning how to compensate, how to fight differently, how to make her right side do work her left side temporarily couldn't. She had torn a ligament in her right knee during a deployment she could not discuss in detail, and come back from it in 14 weeks when the doctors had estimated 20. She had an injury map on her body that would have told any experienced physician a story of someone who had pushed consistently past what seemed survivable. She considered none of this remarkable. It was simply what the job required. When she finished stretching, she sat against the wall and opened the manila folder she'd carried off the bus. Inside were printed bracket sheets, notes she'd made in a small notebook over the past 2 weeks, and 3 photographs. 2 of them were of Reynolds, different angles, one from last year's tournament mid-match and one from a training session. Someone had photographed and posted online. She had studied them the way you study a language you need to become functional in quickly. Not memorizing moves exactly, but reading the grammar. The syntax of how he moved, how he planted his feet, where his weight went when he was confident versus when he was frustrated. Reynolds was a dominant fighter because he was physically exceptional and because he had learned to use intimidation as a pre-fight weapon. Most opponents arrived in the ring already half defeated because he had made them feel before the first contact that the outcome was inevitable. The third photograph was of her father. He was 37 in the photograph, which meant she was 6, and they were standing outside the small gym in Mesa where he first took her to watch a competition. He was kneeling beside her, and she was wearing a red shirt she distinctly remembered, and they were both laughing at something the camera had caught mid-moment. He looked happy in the way that people look happy when they don't know they're being photographed. He died when she was 16, heart attack. Sudden and without warning, the way some of the worst things are. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, touched the edge of it with one finger, and then put the folder away. 6 hours was enough time to do everything she needed. At 2 in the afternoon, the athletic complex was transformed. The main competition floor had been configured with 2 regulation rings, with bleachers pulled out on 3 sides and folding chairs filling the remaining space. By the time the opening ceremonies concluded and the first bracket matches began, there were over 300 people in attendance, soldiers in various combinations of PT gear and service dress officers standing near the back. And a cluster of civilians near the main entrance that Ava noted included 2 men in business suits who were watching everything with the deliberate casualness of people trying not to look like they were watching everything. She learned later they were from the Pentagon. Talent identification. They attended 3 tournaments a year and they did not announce themselves. Ava's first match was at 3:15. Marine Corporal Derek Hicks from the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, 26 years old, 6 feet even 190 pounds. His record in the tournament was solid 2 wins from last year, no losses in the preliminary round so far today. She watched him in his previous match from a spot near the equipment room door. He was good, genuinely good, strong base, aggressive forward pressure, decent ground game. He had the quality that good fighters often have of making the other person feel like they need to keep moving, keep responding, keep reacting rather than dictating their own pace. That quality, she noted, worked because his opponents let it. When she stepped into the ring opposite him, she heard the crowd shift. She had experienced this before, not often, but enough to recognize it. It wasn't hostility exactly, it was adjustment, a recalibration. The collective mind of a crowd, updating its expectations and not being entirely sure what to replace the old picture with. Hicks looked at her across the ring. He had the decency not to perform surprise. He just nodded, settled into his stance, and waited for the signal. She respected that. The match started. Hicks came forward immediately, which she'd expected. He established forward pressure in the first 8 seconds, trying to dictate the pace. She let him. She moved back, not frantically, not defensively, but with control, like something being drawn back in order to gather momentum. She watched his shoulders, his hips, the small telltale shift of his weight before a technique landed. He threw a right cross. She slipped it by 3 inches, close enough to feel the displaced air. He moved into a clinch attempt, and she redirected his momentum using his own forward drive to rotate him 90 degrees. I was fast enough to recover. She noted that, filed it. The first real exchange lasted 37 seconds. When it ended, Hicks stepped back, and there was a particular look on his face. Not defeat, not even close, but something had shifted in his eyes. The recalibration was happening in real time. She wasn't what he'd expected. She was something else. Something that didn't fit the category he'd put her in when he'd looked across the ring 2 minutes ago. Good, she thought. Now we're actually having a conversation. The match turned in the 2nd minute. Hicks went for a leg sweep that was technically well executed, but telegraphed by a very slight drop in his left shoulder that preceded it every single time she'd seen it twice already. When it came, she was already moving. She checked the sweep, caught his extended moment of imbalance, and took him down with a cross-body technique that used his own momentum as the majority of the force. He hit the mat hard, not brutally. She wasn't interested in brutality, but conclusively. He was up in 2 seconds, which was impressive. But the match was effectively decided. She won by judges' decision after the full round, with 2 of 3 panels scoring it clearly in her favor. She stepped out of the ring and walked directly to her water bottle. She didn't look for reactions in the crowd. She didn't scan the bleachers. She heard them, though. The sound of 300 people recategorizing someone is actually quite distinct. It sounds like 1,000 small conversations starting simultaneously, like the first fat drops of rain before a real storm. She knew without looking that Reynolds was watching. She could feel it the way you feel an oncoming headache, not painful yet, but present, certain. He was over by the west wall, standing with 2 other large men from the army contingent, arms crossed, watching. She didn't look at him. She didn't look away from him either. She simply had water-checked the bracket sheet that was posted on the board near the scoring table and noted that her next match was at 5 Hinorum. Army Ranger Corporal Marcus Webb, 28 years old. She had 2 hours. Reynolds said something to the man on his left. The man glanced at her. Reynolds said something else, and both men laughed. It was the kind of laugh that's designed to be noticed by the person it's about. Ava's supervising officer, Sergeant Major Okafor, materialized beside her, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been positioned nearby for exactly this moment. "How does your wrist feel?" Okafor asked. "Casual, conversational." "Fine," Ava said. "You dropped your left hand twice in the second minute." "I know, I was testing his response time." Okafor nodded slowly. She had her own water bottle. She drank. "Reynolds has been talking," she said, "to anyone who'll listen." "I know that too. He's calling it a publicity stunt. Says the Navy sent you here for optics." Ava was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" Okafor looked at her steadily. "I think," she said, "that I've been in the Army for 28 years and I've seen what publicity stunts look like. And I've seen what the real thing looks like. And right now I'm only looking at one of those." Ava felt something move through her chest, small and warm and quickly contained. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." "Don't thank me yet," Okafor said. "Thank me after Webb." She walked away. Ava looked back at the bracket sheet. 5 Haru, Webb. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathed like she already knew. The crowd for the 5 match was larger than the crowd at 3:15. Word had moved through Fort Hardin the way all interesting things move in closed communities, faster than any official channel, finding every corner and corridor, and arriving with embellishment attached. By the time Ava walked to the ring for her second match, the bleachers were full. People were standing along the walls. She heard her name in multiple conversations. Not all of them kind, not all of them unkind, but all of them alive with something that felt a great deal like anticipation. Marcus Webb was a different kind of problem than Hicks. Where Hicks was aggressive and forward-pressed, Webb was patient. He had a long reach, 6'1", and he used it strategically, creating space-controlling distance, making opponents fight on his timeline. He was the kind of fighter who won by making you do what he wanted and then punishing you for it. She had thought about this during her 2 hours. She had done a long walk around the exterior of the athletic complex, thinking not about technique, but about psychology. Webb's style required patience from him too. But patience from a position of control is different from patience from a position of uncertainty. If she could make him uncertain, not frightened, not destabilized, but genuinely unsure of what she was going to do next, his patience would curdle into something more fragile. The match started. Webb was immediately careful with her, which was its own interesting data point. He wasn't treating her the way Hicks had treated her at the beginning. He was treating her the way he'd treat someone whose file he'd already read. He'd been watching, she realized. He'd seen the Hicks match. He'd updated faster than most people would have. She adjusted. She gave him nothing in the first 40 seconds. Moved, feinted, probed, but committed to nothing. She was building a picture of his adjustments, watching how he responded to uncertainty. He was good. He was very good. His fundamentals were close to perfect, and his composure was real rather than performed. But she noticed something in the 90-second mark. When she feinted left, his eyes moved to her right hand a quarter second before her body did. He was anticipating a pattern she hadn't established yet, which meant he was reading something he expected to be there, rather than what was actually there. He'd built a mental model of her, and he was fighting that model, not her. She filed that and waited for her moment. It came at the 2-minute mark. She feinted left, let his eyes go to her right, and went with her left in a direction that fit neither the feint nor his expectation. She caught him in a fractional moment of misalignment, leveraged it into a takedown, and executed a control position on the mat that the judges could not ignore. I was back on his feet in seconds. The remainder of the match was genuinely competitive, and there were 20 seconds near the end where she was legitimately in difficulty. She didn't panic. She returned to her breathing, to her base, to her father's voice in the back of her mind. Patient, patient, wait for the opening, and she found it created space reset. When the judges awarded her the decision, the sound in that building was unlike anything she had heard at 3:15. It wasn't polite. It wasn't performative. It was raw and involuntary, the sound of 500 people encountering something they hadn't been prepared for and not knowing exactly what to do with the feeling. She stepped out of the ring. She did not smile. She did not raise her fist. She did not look at Reynolds. But she heard him. She heard his voice cutting through the crowd. Noise clear, deliberate, aimed, lucky, both of them. She got lucky, and everyone in this room knows it. She stopped. Not because she was going to respond, but because she was making a choice. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, aware of every eye in the room, aware of Reynolds' voice still moving through the crowd, aware of the weight of the moment. Then she picked up her water bottle, picked up her bracket sheet, and walked toward the exit. And that was when Private First Class Daniel Graves, 22 years old from Kansas, who had never spoken to Ava Carter in his life and would not speak to her again until 6 months later, turned to the soldier beside him and said in a voice that wasn't trying to be heard but was anyway, "That wasn't luck. I've been watching this game for 4 years, and that was not luck." The soldier next to him didn't answer, but 3 people around them heard it, and that was how it started. Okafor, standing near the door, watched Ava walk past, watched the room, watched Reynolds, watched the crowd absorbing what it had just seen. She pulled out her phone and updated the text she'd sent earlier. She typed, "Make that something extraordinary." Outside in the fading Texas afternoon light, Ava Carter sat on the ground against the wall of the athletic complex and opened her manila folder. She looked at the bracket sheet. She looked at the 2 photographs of Reynolds. She looked at her father's face. Tomorrow the bracket would pair her with Reynolds directly. She closed the folder, put it carefully back in her duffel bag, closed her eyes, breathed like she already knew. The night after her second win, Ava Carter did not sleep well, not because she was afraid, not because she was doubting herself. She didn't sleep well because the thin mattress in the temporary quarters creaked every time she shifted, and her mind, despite everything she tried, kept returning to one moment. Not Reynolds' hand on her collar, not his boot on her form. The moment after. The 3 seconds she had stood in that room with 500 pairs of eyes on her back, making a choice. She kept replaying it, not with regret, with analysis. She was asking herself if she had made the right call by walking away without a word. She was asking herself if silence had been strength or if it had been something closer to avoidance. She didn't have a clean answer. That bothered her more than Reynolds did. She was up at 5. She ran 4 miles in the dark alone on the perimeter road that circled the eastern edge of the installation. It was still cool at that hour, the Texas sky just beginning to separate from black into the particular dark blue that comes before actual dawn. She ran at a pace that was deliberate but not punishing. She needed her body ready, not emptied. She needed to think, and running was where she thought best. Her father had been the same way. I used to say that the body in motion freed the mind from the habit of going in circles. She thought about Webb, about the moment at the 90-second mark when she'd realized he was fighting his idea of her rather than her actual self. That had been the key. People built models of you in their heads and then fought the model instead of the person. It was one of the most consistent patterns she had identified across every competitive context she'd ever been in. Reynolds had been doing it since the moment he saw her name on that registration form. He had built a model, placed her inside it, and was now fighting that model with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been wrong about this particular category of assessment before. That was his weakness. She just needed him to hold on to that model all the way into the ring. She finished her run, cooled down, showered, and was in the small cafeteria by 6:15. She got coffee and a plate of eggs and sat at a corner table with her back to the wall, which was not a habit she had chosen consciously. It had simply become the way she sat in her rooms after enough years of training that rewired certain instincts permanently. She had been there for maybe 10 minutes when Private Daniel Graves sat down across from her. She recognized him, the young soldier from Kansas who had said loud enough to be heard that her win over Webb wasn't luck. He was 22, slight, with the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed what he wants to say and is now terrified that the rehearsal wasn't enough. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "You're not bothering me," she said. He looked at her plate, then at his own hands. "I just wanted to say what you did yesterday in both those matches. I've been watching this tournament for 4 years, and I've seen a lot of people fight, and that wasn't luck. What Reynolds is saying, it's not true, and I think somebody should tell you that somebody else sees it." She looked at him for a moment. He was so young. He had the kind of earnestness that hasn't been worn down yet by enough exposure to how complicated the world actually is. "What's your name?" she asked. "Graves, Daniel Graves, Private First Class." "How long have you been in Private Graves?" 14 months, she nodded. "What made you join?" He blinked. Clearly that wasn't the direction he had expected the conversation to go. "My grandfather," he said. "He was Army, Korea. He used to say that the most important thing a person can do is show up for something bigger than themselves." He paused. "I know that probably it sounds exactly right," as she said. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been given something they were not expecting. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Are you scared of Reynolds?" She considered the question. She respected it enough to give it a real answer rather than the quick, reflexive kind. "Scared isn't quite the right word," she said. "He's a legitimate threat. He's strong, he's experienced, and he's angry, which makes him more dangerous, not less. Anger makes people hit harder. It also makes them make mistakes. Both of those things are true at the same time. So what do you do with that?" "I stay patient," she said. "Patience is the only thing that works against someone who wants to overwhelm you. You let the wave come. You don't try to stop it. You redirect it." Graves sat with that for a moment. "That's what your father taught you." She went very still. "Where did you hear about my father?" "I didn't," he said quickly. "I'm sorry. Reynolds was saying something last night. I don't know what exactly, I just caught part of it. Something about your background, I assumed." She let the stillness pass. "My father taught me a great many things," she said. "Yes." She finished her coffee, picked up her tray, stood. "Thank you for what you said yesterday," she told him. "It mattered." She left. Graves sat at the table alone and stared at the place where her coffee cup had been. At 8 that morning, the bracket results for day 2 were posted on the board outside the athletic complex. A crowd gathered around it within 60 seconds of the sheet going up. The news moved through that crowd in layers, first the people closest reading it, then the information radiating outward in lowered voices and quick glances, and then, by the time it had traveled to the outer edges, it wasn't information anymore, but electricity. Ava Carter versus Brock Reynolds, 2:00 p.m. She was standing 30 feet away when she heard it. She didn't move toward the board. She already knew what was on it. What she watched instead was Reynolds. He was across the courtyard near the entrance to the training facility, and someone had just told him. She watched his face go through something that most people would have read as anger, but that she read differently. There was anger in it, yes, but underneath the anger was something that surprised her. Relief. And he had wanted this. He had wanted it from the moment she'd said those 4 words in the registration tent. He had been waiting for the bracket to sanction what he'd already decided was inevitable. She could see it in the way his shoulders settled, not tensed, but settled, like a man who had been holding something and was finally allowed to set it down. That told her something important. Reynolds wasn't approaching this match as an obstacle. He was approaching it as a conclusion. A statement, something that would end a conversation he felt had been started without his permission. That was a problem. Not because it made him more dangerous, though it did, but because it meant he would not be thinking clearly. He would be performing, and performance in a ring cost you the fractions of seconds that determined everything. She went to the auxiliary training space, the broken air conditioning, the heat. She worked for 90 minutes alone running combinations she had drilled 10,000 times until they stopped being thoughts and became reflexes. She worked on one specific sequence, a counter to a high-power lateral strike, until she could execute it without any conscious initiation, until her body did it before her brain had finished deciding to. At 11, Okafor found her. "Sit down," Okafor said. Not a request. Ava sat. Okafor sat across from her. She had a folder of her own. She opened it. Reynolds' medical history, Okafor said, as much as I can access without crossing lines. He had a right shoulder reconstruction 14 months ago. He's been cleared for full duty, but the range of motion is not what it was. He compensates with torque. He generates power through rotation more than extension. She paused. You noticed that already, didn't you? The way he stands, Ava said. Yes. There's something else. Okapor's voice shifted slightly, became more careful. Reynolds has been talking to the two Pentagon observers. Ava waited. I don't know exactly what he said, but I know that after he talked to them, one of them made a phone call, and then both of them spent 20 minutes with the tournament director. What are they trying to do? I think, Okafor said slowly, that he is trying to get you withdrawn from the bracket on some kind of procedural grounds. Or get the match refereed by someone he knows. She held Ava's gaze. I've filed a counter-objection. I have a contact in the oversight office. But I want you to understand if there is any conduct violation on your part, any reason they can point to, they will use it. Ava absorbed this. He's scared, she said. He's desperate, Okafor corrected. Which is worse. You should have seen his face when he found out about the bracket, Ava said. He was relieved. He wants this fight. He wants to win this fight, Okafor said. There's a difference. The morning dragged. She ate lunch. She couldn't taste it. That happens sometimes before matches. Her senses narrowed, not in panic but in focus like a lens tightening. She sat with her eyes open and reviewed everything she knew. Reynolds' right shoulder, his compensatory rotation, his tendency to perform in front of crowds, his anger, which was real and which would make him hit harder in the early minutes and then begin to cost him as the match continued, his left shoulder strain that had never fully resolved, the slightly longer load time on his right kick because of the reconstruction, 1/4 of a second, maybe less, but enough. At 1 o'clock, Graves found her again. He didn't sit down this time. He stood a few feet away, and there was something different in his expression. Urgency. There's something you should know, he said. Reynolds was in the locker room this morning. I wasn't supposed to be in there. I was looking for a training partner and took a wrong turn. But I heard him. He stopped. Tell me, she said. I was talking to 2 guys from his unit. He said, Graves swallowed. He said that if the bracket doesn't get changed, he was going to make sure you couldn't finish the match. That he was going to put you on the floor in the first 30 seconds and make it look like you stepped wrong. He paused. He said it like he was making a plan, not like he was venting. The room felt very quiet around her. Did anyone else hear it? She asked. One other person, Specialist Kim. She was behind the lockers. She heard the whole thing. Will she report it? Graves hesitated. She's scared of Reynolds. His unit, they're tight and she has to work alongside them. He looked at the floor. But I will. I'll report it, if you want me to. She looked at him for a long moment. 22 years old, 14 months in, his grandfather who served in Korea. Don't report it yet, she said. Not because I'm afraid of him, but because if we report it now and it gets dismissed, he knows we heard it and he'll adjust. Right now, he thinks he has a plan that nobody knows about. I want him to walk into that ring still thinking that. Graves stared at her. You're going to use it. I'm going to be ready for it, she said, and there's a difference. He nodded slowly. Something moved in his expression. Not awe exactly, something more complex than awe, recognition. I'll stand by, he said. If you need me to testify to what I heard after, I'll do it. I want you to know that. I know, she said. Thank you, Private Graves. He left. She sat with what she'd been told for exactly 3 minutes. She let herself feel it, not the fear, but the shape of what Reynolds had decided to do. He wasn't approaching this as a competition anymore. He had decided that the outcome was more important than the method. That was the point where a man stopped being a competitor and became something else. She knew how to fight a competitor. She was good at it. She had trained for what he was becoming. At 1:45, she walked to the main athletic complex. The building was already packed. Bleachers were at capacity. Standing room was full. She heard later that people had started gathering from noon soldiers who had not planned to watch the afternoon matches, but who had heard the bracket results and rearranged their days. There were officers in the crowd that hadn't been there the day before. Senior NCOs, people who had titles and experience in the weight of institutional knowledge. Standing along the walls of that building, waiting, the two Pentagon men were back. They were in different positions than yesterday. Closer to the ring, Reynolds was already there when she entered. He was on the far side of the ring going through his warm-up. His movements were large and deliberate, designed to be seen. He was performing confidence for the crowd, and the crowd was receiving it. She could see people near him, nodding, talking, feeding the energy he was projecting. She did not look at him directly. She found her side, put down her bag, began her own warm-up. Quiet, internal. She was having that conversation with her body again. Are you ready? Yes. What do you need? Nothing. What are you telling me? He's going to go for the first 30 seconds. Stay on your feet. Don't let him take you down early. Make him work. The referee called them to the center. Reynolds walked toward her with the heavy, unhurried certainty of someone who had already finished writing the ending. He stopped at the center line, looked at her from above, 6'2" to her 5'7", 230, to her 143. In front of 500 witnesses, he let that differential register. He wanted the crowd to see it. He wanted her to feel it. She looked directly at him. Last chance, he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. Walk away right now and I'll tell everyone you had an injury. You go home clean. Thank you for the offer, she said. I'm serious. So am I, she said. Let's go. Something happened in his eyes then. The relief she'd seen that morning when he found out about the bracket, it was still there underneath everything else. But on top of it now was something new. Something she had seen before in opponents who had built an entire emotional architecture around a particular outcome and were just beginning to suspect in the last moments before contact that the architecture might not hold. The referee raised his hand. The crowd went completely silent. 500 people. Not a sound. And then the hand came down and everything began. Reynolds moved immediately. She had expected it 30 seconds, Graves had said, and Reynolds himself had laid out the plan. He came forward with full pressure, trying to close distance, trying to overwhelm before she could establish anything. His first combination was powerful. She slipped the first strike, absorbed a glancing contact on the second that she hadn't fully escaped, not damaging but enough to feel, and moved laterally, denying him the straight line drive he needed to execute his takedown. He adjusted fast, faster than she would have preferred. He cut off her lateral movement, drove inside her guard, and for 3 seconds she was genuinely in trouble. The crowd made a sound, involuntary collective, the specific sound of 500 people seeing something go a direction they didn't expect. She felt the pressure of his hands on her arms, felt the rotational force he was building for the throw, and made the decision she'd been preparing for all morning. She didn't fight the momentum. She went with it, redirected it, used the torque he was generating, that compensatory rotation from the rebuilt shoulder against the direction he intended. It wasn't clean, it was messy and physical, and she took another contact she would feel tomorrow. But she came out of it on her feet, and he came out of it 2 steps off balance, and for one fractional moment, he was exactly where she needed him to be. She didn't take the opening, not yet. She wanted him to know she'd seen it. Reynolds recovered. He was breathing harder than he'd planned to be at this point. She could see it in his chest. She could see something else, too, the beginning of something she recognized and had been waiting for. The plan he'd walked in with was not going exactly as he'd written it. And Reynolds, for all his strength and experience, was not a man who had spent much time learning how to adapt when the plan failed. He had succeeded too consistently, too dominantly, for too long to have been forced to develop that particular skill. Now he needed it, and it wasn't there. She watched him reset his stance, watched his jaw tighten, watched the anger, the real anger, not the performed kind, begin to replace the calculation in his eyes. His right hand opened and closed once. Small gesture. She filed it. 3 minutes in, they were still on their feet, and the crowd had not made another sound since that involuntary reaction in the first 40 seconds. The silence was extraordinary. 500 people holding 500 different versions of the same breath. Okafor, standing near the scoring table, had her arms folded and her face absolutely still, but her right hand pressed against her own arm, was gripping hard enough that her knuckles had changed color. Graves was in the bleachers. He hadn't sat down. He was standing with his hands pressed flat against the railing in front of him, watching with the concentrated intensity of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing and was still unable to fully believe it. Reynolds moved again. This time there was less calculation in it, more force, more rage beginning to leak through the professional surface. She saw it coming before it arrived, and she was patient. Patient like she'd learned to be. Patient like her father had taught her when she was 9 years old and terrified, and he had knelt beside her and said, "Breathe like you already won." She breathed. She waited. She watched the fractional tell in his left shoulder, the slight load in his right hip, the anger beginning to override the training. She waited for the moment that was coming. It was almost there. The moment arrived at the 4-minute mark. Not with a warning, not with any of the telegraphed buildup that Reynolds had been showing her in the previous 3 minutes. It arrived the way real danger always arrives, suddenly with complete commitment, from a man who had run out of patience and decided that force was the only language left. Reynolds planted his left foot, pivoted his full body weight into a rotational kick, aimed at her midsection. Not a technique, a statement. He was throwing everything he had into a single movement designed to end the conversation permanently, to put her on the floor in front of 500 witnesses and close whatever door she had opened when she'd walked into that registration tent 2 days ago. The crowd saw it coming before it landed. She heard the intake of breath, 500 people inhaling simultaneously like the sound a room makes right before the lights go out. She was already moving, not back, forward. She stepped into the strike inside its arc, into the space where his power had nowhere to go. And in the same motion, she caught his extended leg at the knee joint, applied rotational force in the direction his own momentum had committed him to, and executed the counter she had drilled in that heat-broken auxiliary room until it stopped being a thought and became a reflex. She heard it before the crowd did, a sound she had been trained to recognize and had always hoped she would never have to produce in competition. A sound that is difficult to describe to someone who has never been close to it, but that anyone who has heard it in a real context never forgets. Reynolds went down. He did not go down the way a man goes down when he's been outfought. He went down the way a structure collapses when a load-bearing element fails fast total without the possibility of recovery. He hit the mat, and the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was something below language, something involuntary and raw that cut through every other sound in that building and silenced 500 people in less than a second. The referee was moving before Reynolds finished falling. Ava stepped back. Her hands came down. She was breathing hard the first time in the match she'd let herself breathe hard, and she stood in the center of that ring with her eyes open and her mind processing what had just happened with the cold, clear precision of someone who had been trained to assess outcomes without the luxury of emotional reaction. I was injured. Seriously. She could see it in the angle of his leg, in the way he was holding himself, in the sound still coming from him. She had not intended to cause this specific injury. She had intended to counter a dangerous strike with a controlled technique. But she had also known, executing it, that the physics of the situation gave her limited options. He had committed fully. She had redirected fully. The joint had not been able to absorb the result. She felt something complex move through her. Not satisfaction. Not guilt exactly. Something that lived in the narrow space between them. The particular weight of a consequence that was both necessary and irreversible at the same time. The referee knelt beside Reynolds. 2 medics were already crossing the floor. The crowd did not move, did not speak. 500 people standing in absolute stillness, which is one of the most unusual sounds in the world, the sound of complete absence. Then someone in the back of the bleachers said in a voice that carried because nothing else was filling the air, "Oh my God." And then the room came back to life all at once. Ava Carter was at the ring's edge before the medics reached the center. Not inside, she had enough discipline for that, but at the edge, her eyes moving between Reynolds on the mat and Ava standing above him, assessing both of them with the rapid practiced judgment of someone who had been in enough serious situations to know immediately which elements required which responses. "Carter," she said. Her voice was quiet and even and carried more authority than a shout. "Step back, all the way to your corner." Ava stepped back. She went to her corner and sat on the ring step and put her head down and breathed. She could hear Reynolds. She could hear the medics working. She could hear the crowd not panicked but alive, electric, the sound of 500 people who had witnessed something they were still assembling into meaning. Graves was gripping the railing so hard it had left marks on his palms. He would notice them an hour later and not remember doing it. He was watching Ava sit in her corner with her head down, and he was thinking about what she'd said that morning at the table. Patience is the only thing that works against someone who wants to overwhelm you. And he was realizing that he was watching someone live that sentence in real time right now, including in this moment after the patience extending past the match into whatever came next. The two Pentagon men had moved. They were no longer in their positions near the main viewing area. They were standing together close, talking quietly and quickly. One of them had his phone out and was typing. The other was watching the ring with an expression that wasn't readable at any single emotion. It was the expression of someone recalibrating an entire set of assumptions in real time and not yet finished with the work. Reynolds was taken off the mat on a stretcher at 4 minutes and 38 seconds after the match had started. He was conscious. The sounds he was making had changed from the raw, involuntary ones to something quieter and more controlled, which told Ava, listening from her corner, that the initial shock was passing and something harder was settling in. Not just pain, the awareness of what had happened, where he was, how he had gotten here. The tournament director, a colonel named Hargrove, who had been running this event for 7 years and had seen a great many things in those 7 years, none quite like this, walked to the center of the ring and spoke to the referee for 45 seconds. Then he walked to the scoring table. Then he came to Ava's corner. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was a genuine question. She could hear it. "I'm okay," she said. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment. He was a man who had the kind of face that showed its history not unpleasantly, but honestly. 60 years old, 38 years of service. He had the look of someone who had spent a long time trying to do the right thing and had learned that the right thing was rarely simple. "I need to ask you some questions," he said. "Not right this moment. In 20 minutes in my office. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." He left. She sat. Okafor came into the ring. She sat beside Ava on the step without preamble or performance. She didn't say anything for a full minute. They just sat together in that ring while the crowd around them reorganized itself and the medics completed their work, and the building buzzed with the particular energy of an event that has crossed out of the ordinary into something larger. "He telegraphed it," Ava said finally. "It wasn't a defense, it was a statement of fact. The left shoulder drop a hip load. I've seen it twice already in the previous minutes. When he committed to the strike full rotation, I had two options, and one of them put me on the floor. I chose the other one." "I know," Okafor said. "I didn't go in there trying to—" "Carter." Okapor's voice was quiet. "I know, I watched the whole match. I watched every single second of it. You executed a legal counter technique against an aggressive strike. What happened is a consequence of the physics of his commitment to that strike, not of any intent on your part." She paused. "The question isn't whether you were right. You were right. The question is what happens now." Ava looked at her. "What does happen now?" "Now," Okafor said carefully, "is when it gets complicated." Hargrove's office was not large. At the 20-minute mark after the match, it contained Ava, Okafor, Colonel Hargrove, the tournament's JAG officer, and which was the first surprise one of the two Pentagon men. He introduced himself as Director Caldwell without elaborating on what he directed. He was 50-something, compact with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that the less they moved, the more other people revealed. Hargrove began. "I want to be clear that this is not a disciplinary proceeding. This is a factual review. The match was sanctioned. The techniques used were within regulation. We are here to establish a clear record of events." He looked at Ava. "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me what happened, in your own words, from the point of Reynolds' final technique." She told him, exactly, clearly, in the ordered and precise language that years of after-action reporting had given her. No embellishment, no omission. She described the strike, the commitment, the counter, the outcome. She described her intent, which was to neutralize a dangerous technique and remain on her feet. She described the sound she had heard, which she identified as what it was, without flinching from the identification. When she finished, Hargrove looked at the JAG officer. The JAG officer had been taking notes. He nodded once without looking up. Caldwell spoke for the first time. "Petty Officer Carter." His voice was even and without particular effect. "I want to ask you something that is outside the scope of this review, but that I would like you to answer honestly." "Go ahead, sir." "Before the match began, were you aware that Sergeant Reynolds had discussed in the presence of witnesses an intention to take you down by irregular means within the first 30 seconds. The room went very still. Ava did not look at Okafor. She kept her eyes on Caldwell. Yes, she said, and you proceeded with the match anyway. Yes. Why, she thought about Graves, about his earnest face at the breakfast table, about his grandfather in Korea, and the idea of showing up for something bigger than yourself. She thought about the 3 seconds she'd stood with her back to the crowd after the web match making a choice. Because withdrawing would have confirmed what he wanted the room to believe, she said, that I didn't belong there, and I still believed that the best answer to that argument was to compete, cleanly, within the rules, and let the outcome speak. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something in his own small notebook and closed it. Hargrove cleared his throat. For the record, who were the witnesses to Reynolds' stated intent? Private First Class Daniel Graves, Ava said, and Specialist Kim, whose unit and full name I don't have, but who was present in the locker room at approximately 10 a.m. this morning. Hargrove looked at the JAG officer again. Find them both, he said, today. The meeting lasted 40 minutes total. When it ended, Ava walked out into a hallway that had not been crowded when she'd gone in, and was now containing 9 people who had not been there before, including 3 soldiers she'd never seen, 2 officers, and Daniel Graves, who had clearly been waiting and who looked at her with an expression of such concentrated anxiety that she almost smiled. Well, he said. It's fine, she said. They're going to want to talk to you. I know. I already talked to someone from the JAG office 20 minutes ago. He paused. I also gave them Specialist Kim's information. She agreed to come forward. I talked to her while you were in there. Ava stopped. How did you convince her? Graves looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. I told her what you told me this morning. About patience. About letting the wave come. I told her that the right thing to do is almost never the easy thing, but it's the only thing that means anything after. He shrugged slightly, self-conscious. She has a daughter. She said she wanted her daughter to see her do the right thing. Something moved through Ava's chest again. The same small, warm thing as before, but larger this time. She let it be there for a moment. Good, she said. You did good, Private Graves. He straightened slightly, not consciously, just the automatic physical response of a 22-year-old who has been told he did something right by someone he respects. What happens now, he asked. To Reynolds, I mean. I don't know yet, she said honestly. To you? She considered. I go to dinner, she said, and then I sleep. And then tomorrow I figure out the rest. He laughed, short, surprised, genuine. The first genuine laugh either of them had produced all day. That's it. That's it, she said, one thing at a time. But that was not quite it, because 40 minutes after she left Hargrove's office, while she was sitting in the cafeteria with a plate of food, she was actually managing to taste this time. Okafor sat down across from her with an expression that Ava had not seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone carrying information that is both significant and delicate, and who is working out the right way to deliver it. Caldwell wants to meet with you again tomorrow morning, Okafor said. Not as part of the review, separately. Ava set down her fork. What does he want? He didn't say specifically, but I know what his office does, Carter. I've been in the Army long enough to know exactly what Pentagon talent identification does and what kind of meeting they request and why. She held Ava's gaze. This is not about what happened in the ring today. Or not only about that. Ava sat with this, outside the cafeteria windows. The Texas evening was happening, the sky doing its thing, the installation going through its nighttime rhythms. She was aware in a way she hadn't been at the beginning of this day of how much had shifted in the 12 hours since she'd run 4 miles in the dark, thinking about Webb's model of her and whether patience was strength or avoidance. Why today, she said half to herself. Why this match, this tournament? Because 500 people saw it, Okafor said simply. Because 2 of those people are from an office that watches for specific things, and today they saw one of those things. And because, she paused, because Reynolds has been a protected figure for a long time. His record, his wins, his profile, he has had people around him who have insulated him from accountability. What happened today and what Graves and Kim are reporting is going to remove that insulation. And the people who maintained it are going to have questions to answer. She folded her hands on the table. Caldwell knows all of this, and he is interested in the person who caused it. Not by trying to bring Reynolds down, just by competing. Only pasa your hand. The cafeteria was relatively quiet at this hour. A few small groups of soldiers at other tables, the distant sound of a TV somewhere, the hum of institutional lighting. Ava looked at her food. How's Reynolds? She asked. Okafor blinked, slightly surprised by the question, or maybe by the way it was asked, which was direct and unperformative and genuine. Surgery tonight. His leg is broken in two places, tibia and fibula from what I heard. He'll be off full duty for several months. Ava nodded. She picked up her fork again. Does that change anything for you? Okafor asked. Not a challenge, a real question. Ava thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about hard things. It changes how I feel, she said. It doesn't change whether what I did was right. Those are different. She paused. I don't want him to be hurt. I never wanted that. But I also couldn't let him do what he was planning to do without responding. And I couldn't respond with anything less than everything I had because he wasn't holding anything back. No, Okafor said quietly. He wasn't. So I'm going to hold both things, Ava said. The fact that it was right and the fact that it cost something, both at the same time. Okafor looked at her across the table for a long moment. Her expression was not one that Ava could fully categorize. It was something between respect and something more personal than respect. Something that might have been what it looks like when you see a version of a quality in someone else that you spent years trying to develop in yourself. Your father, Okafor said. You mentioned him. This morning Graves told me you talked about him. I did. What was he? A teacher, Ava said. High school. History. She smiled slightly. He wasn't military. He just believed that the same things that win wars win ordinary life. Patience. Preparation. The willingness to absorb discomfort without letting it change who you are. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was, Ava said. He really was. They sat together in the quiet of the cafeteria. Two women in a world that had not always made room for them. Eating dinner after an extraordinary day, talking about a man who had taught his daughter to breathe like she already won. Across the installation in the medical facility, Reynolds lay in a bed with his leg immobilized and a medication drip, making the edges of his pain softer but not absent. He was alone. His unit had come by earlier and then left because there was only so long you could sit with someone in a bed and not say the thing that was filling the room, and none of them were ready to say it yet. He stared at the ceiling. He had been in this installation for 6 years. He had won 3 tournaments. He had been in the accounting that he had always used for his own life, someone who could not be beaten, not because he was perfect, but because the people around him had always confirmed that assessment. No one had pushed back. No one had said out loud and in front of witnesses that they saw something different. Until 2 days ago, until a 24-year-old Navy SEAL in a gray long-sleeve shirt had stood in a registration tent and said 4 words that reopened a question he thought had been permanently closed. He didn't think about the injury. He thought about those 4 words. I'm a Navy SEAL, not angry, not defensive, just certain, the way you say your own name. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. In the bleachers hours after the match had ended, Graves sat in the empty athletic complex alone in the dark, which technically he wasn't supposed to do, and which he did anyway because he needed to sit somewhere that held the shape of what had happened without the noise of other people's reactions filling it up. He sat in the 3rd row where he'd stood during the match, and he looked at the empty ring and thought about his grandfather in Korea and about what showing up for something bigger than yourself actually looked like when you were inside it rather than hearing about it afterward. I thought it looked like a woman stepping forward into the arc of a strike that was meant to end her. He thought it looked like choosing not to run. He thought it looked like patience so absolute it could be mistaken for stillness, right up until the moment it became the most decisive action in the room. He stayed there for 40 minutes. Then he went to bed. And somewhere on the other side of the installation, Ava Carter lay in the creaking temporary quarters bunk in the dark. And for the first time in 2 days, she was not reviewing match footage in her head, not running scenarios, not asking herself whether she had made the right calls. She was thinking about tomorrow morning, about Caldwell, about what Okafor had said. This is not about what happened in the ring today. Or not only about that. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Not like she was hoping, like she already knew. She was up at 5 again, same time as the day before, same dark sky, same perimeter road, same deliberate pace. but everything else was different, and she felt that difference in her body the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Not in any single place, but everywhere at once, a shift in pressure that the body registers before the mind has finished processing it. Yesterday, she had run to think. Today, she ran because she didn't want to think. She wanted to be only motion and breath and the sound of her boots on the road in the dark, with the Texas sky doing its slow work above her and the installation quiet around her. She needed 20 minutes of not being Ava Carter, who had broken a man's leg in front of 500 people. She needed 20 minutes of just being a body moving through space, which asks nothing of you and requires nothing from you except to keep going. She got 18. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stopped, looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which read only, "Morning Petty Officer, Caldwell, 7 a.m. not 8, Building C, Room 14. Bring Sergeant Major Okafor if you want her there." She put the phone back, stood in the dark for a moment. Then she ran the last quarter mile back to quarters faster than she'd run anything in 2 days. By 6:45, she and Okafor were walking side by side across the installation, their breath visible in the early morning cold, neither of them saying much. Okafor had gotten the text forwarded to her at 6:15 and had appeared at Ava's door at 6:30 without being asked, already, dressed already, carrying coffee in 2 cups, already wearing the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and decided that the correct response is to be present and prepared and say very little. She handed Ava one of the cups without a word. Ava took it without a word. They walked. Building C was administrative. Room 14 was at the far end of a corridor that smelled like floor wax and old coffee, which was a smell Ava associated with every official meeting she'd ever had in the military, and which had the particular effect of making her feel simultaneously calm and alert, the way a familiar smell can anchor you inside a moment that would otherwise feel unreal. Caldwell was already there. So was the second Pentagon man, who introduced himself as Deputy Director Walsh and who was younger than Caldwell by about 10 years, with the particular alertness of someone who sleeps well and thinks fast. There was also a woman Ava hadn't seen before, mid-40s, in civilian dress with a notepad, in the contained manner of someone who was there to observe and record rather than participate. Hargrove was there too, which surprised her. He was in full service dress. He nodded at her when she came in. They sat. Caldwell opened without preamble. "The JAG office completed its preliminary review at 11 p.m. last night," he said. "I've read the summary. I want you to know where things stand, and then I want to have a different conversation." He looked at her steadily. "The preliminary finding is that Petty Officer Carter's actions during the match were within the boundaries of sanctioned tournament competition. The counter technique used was legal. The degree of force applied was consistent with the demands of the situation, and there ain't no basis for any disciplinary action." He paused. "Additionally, the statements of Private Graves and Specialist Kim regarding Sergeant Reynolds' pre-match statements have been formally recorded. Those statements are being reviewed by Reynolds' chain of command, and Reynolds himself is under suspension pending that review." Okafor beside Ava let out a very controlled breath, almost silent. Ava caught it anyway. "Thank you, sir," Ava said. "Don't thank me," Caldwell said. "The facts thanked you. I just read them." He shifted slightly, leaned forward. "Now I want to have the other conversation." Walsh opened a folder. The woman with the notepad had her pen ready. "How long have you been a SEAL?" Caldwell asked. 18 months since formal qualification, 4 years in the pipeline before that. "Deployments, 3. I can give you details under appropriate classification." "We have your file," Walsh said, not dismissively, practically. "We've read it, all of it." Ava waited. Caldwell looked at her in the way that she was beginning to recognize as his particular mode of assessment, not aggressive, not soft, just completely present, like a camera that doesn't blink. "What I'm going to tell you is not an offer. It's not a formal proposal. It's a conversation, and everything said in this room is preliminary and unofficial until and unless it becomes otherwise. Do you understand that distinction?" "Yes, sir." "There is a program," he said carefully. "Joint Services, Cross Branch. It's been operating for 4 years, and its existence is not classified, but its specifics are. It identifies personnel who demonstrate a particular combination of physical capability, psychological resilience, And this is the part that it's harder to define what I'll call moral clarity under pressure. He stopped. The ability to do the right thing when every element of the situation is working against you, doing it, when it would be easier, safer, and more professionally convenient to do something else. The room was very quiet. Yesterday, Caldwell continued, you were given approximately 6 opportunities to do something else. You could have withdrawn when Reynolds tore your form. You could have reported his locker room statements and forced a procedural resolution. You could have fought defensively in the match and accepted a points decision instead of a conclusive outcome. You could have at any point made this smaller and safer and easier. He paused. You didn't do any of those things. You competed. You competed cleanly within the rules with full commitment, and you let the outcome be what the outcome was going to be. I didn't think of it that way, Ava said honestly. What did you think of it as? She considered. The right thing was also the clear thing, she said. I knew what I was capable of. I knew what he was. The question was whether I was going to let what he thought of me determine how I competed. And I wasn't. She paused. It wasn't complicated. It felt complicated from the outside, maybe. From the inside, it was just clear. Walsh wrote something. The woman with the notepad wrote something. Caldwell did not write anything. He kept looking at her. Your father, he said. She went still. Not defensively, she was beginning to recognize that people who'd read her file fully always arrived at her father because her file, if you read between the clinical language of it, told the story of someone who had been shaped by a loss and had turned that loss into a compass rather than a wound. What about him, she said. The file notes he passed when you were 16. That you entered preliminary military interest programs within 8 months of his death. Caldwell's voice was even, not cold, even. That's a fast response to significant grief. He would have wanted me to keep moving, she said. Simply, without performance. You're certain of that? He spent 16 years teaching me exactly that. Yes, I'm certain. Caldwell nodded once, then he glanced at Walsh, and something passed between them that was too small and too fast for Ava to read, but that Okafor caught, she could tell, because Okafor's posture shifted by a fraction beside her. There's something else I need to tell you, Caldwell said. His tone changed slightly, not warmer or colder, more careful. The way a person's voice becomes more careful when they're approaching something that has weight. Since last night, the incident at this tournament has received significant outside attention. What kind of attention? Okafor said. First time she'd spoken, Walsh answered. Someone in attendance recorded portions of the match on a personal device. The footage was posted to social media at approximately 9 p.m. last night. As of 6 a.m. this morning, it had been viewed 11 million times across 3 platforms. The number landed in the room like something physical. Ava heard it, processed it, said nothing. 11 million, Okafor said, and climbing Walsh confirmed, the story is being picked up by major news outlets as of this morning. We have media requests going to the installation's public affairs office. We have congressional staff making inquiries. We have, he paused, glancing at his own notes, advocacy organizations, veterans groups, civilian media, and at least one network news program requesting access. Ava sat with this for a moment. 11 million people. The number was too large to feel real. It was the kind of number that exists in a category beyond personal experience, like the distance to a star, technically meaningful, but not something the human mind can actually hold. What does that mean for me, she asked. It means, Caldwell said, that the conversation you started by walking into that registration tent 2 days ago has now become significantly larger than Fort Hardin, Texas. He held her gaze. And it means that how you conduct yourself in the next 48 hours will matter in ways that extend well beyond your personal career. What are you asking me to do? Right now, nothing. I'm asking you to understand the scope of what you're in. And I'm asking you to maintain exactly the same standard you've maintained for the past 2 days. He almost smiled. Not quite. Which, based on evidence, I don't think I need to ask. The meeting ended at 8:15. Ava and Okafor walked out into a morning that was the same morning it had been an hour ago. Same sky, same installation, same Texas air. But that felt fundamentally different in the way that mornings feel different after you've received information that changes the dimensions of the world you're operating in. 11 million, Ava said when they were far enough from Building C that the words felt like hers. It'll be 20 by noon, Okafor said. Not unkindly, just practically. I don't know how to. Ava stopped, started again. I didn't do this for anyone to watch. I know, Okafor said. I did it because it was right. Because walking away would have meant… Carter. Okafor stopped walking, turned to face her. Her voice was not sharp, but it was firm in the way that a good teacher's voice is firm, not to silence you, but to focus you. What you did and why you did it are yours. Nobody can touch that. The 11 million people watching, they're responding to something real, which is why there are 11 million of them. But what was real was what happened in that ring between you and Reynolds and the decision you made every single time you had the choice. That's not changed by the number of people watching it. Ava looked at her. Did you know, she asked, when you watched from the edge of the ring yesterday, did you know it was going to go that way? Okafor considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I knew something was going to happen, she said. I didn't know what. I've been in the Army 28 years, and I've learned to recognize the feeling of a moment that's about to become something permanent. She paused. I felt that feeling when Reynolds tore your form in the registration tent. I knew then that whatever happened next was going to matter beyond this installation. They started walking again. I was so certain, Ava said. Reynolds, not just confident certain, like the outcome was already written and he was just showing up to confirm it. That kind of certainty is its own weakness, Okafor said. You knew that? I knew it intellectually, but standing across from it… She paused. It's heavy. That kind of certainty from someone that size with that record. It has weight. You have to choose not to let it land on you. And you chose. Every 30 seconds, Ava said. The whole match. Every time he moved, I had to choose again not to be what he already decided I was. Okafor was quiet for a moment, then, that's what it always is. Not one big choice. 1,000 small ones. At 9 a.m. Ava went to the medical facility. She had decided this during the walk back from Building C without quite realizing she'd decided it until she found herself heading in that direction. Okafor beside her didn't comment, didn't redirect, just adjusted her own course to match. Reynolds was in room 7. She knew because she asked at the front desk, and the nurse, after a pause that communicated several things without words, told her. She stood outside the door for a moment. Not because she was gathering courage, she didn't experience it as requiring courage, but because she wanted to be clear in her own mind about why she was there and what she was going to say. She was not there to apologize for winning. She was not there to perform compassion for an audience. She was there because she had been raised by a man who believed that you did not stop seeing the humanity in someone just because they had acted without it towards you. She knocked, a pause. Then Reynolds' voice, rougher than it had been in the ring but recognizable, come in. She opened the door and stepped inside. I was in the bed with his leg immobilized and elevated. He looked like a man who had not slept and had spent the hours that should have been sleeping, doing something harder and more private. He looked at her and his face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then something close to anger, then something that was too complex to name quickly like a chord with too many notes. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, what do you want? I don't want anything, she said. I came to see how you were doing. He stared at her. You broke my leg. Your technique broke your leg, she said, not defensively, factually. The commitment you put into that strike, if I hadn't countered it, the force would have landed. Either way, something was going to be conclusive. He looked at the ceiling. His jaw worked. You could have stepped back, taken the hit, let the match continue. I could have, she said. I chose not to. Because you wanted to win. Because I didn't want to lose on terms that weren't mine, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long time. The room had the particular stillness of a medical space, not peaceful exactly, but suspended. Outside the door, the sounds of the facility continued without them. I heard about Graves, he said finally, and Kim, about what they reported. She didn't respond. She waited. I said what I said, he said. His voice had changed. The performance was gone from it, and what was left was something rawer and less comfortable. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I know, she said. I wanted to end it before it started, he said. I wanted the room to see. He stopped, started again with what seemed like considerable effort. I've been that guy my whole career. The one who wins, the one who everyone expects to win. And you walked in, and I could feel it the way the room started paying attention to you instead of… He stopped again. Ava waited. I don't know how to explain it in a way that sounds like anything other than what it was, he said. You don't have to explain it, she said. I think I do. His voice was very quiet now. Not to you, to myself. She stood in that room for a few more minutes. She didn't sit down. She didn't offer words that would make it easier than it needed to be. She was present, which was what she'd come to be. When she left, she stood in the corridor outside his door and took a breath. Okafor was waiting 20 feet down the hall, giving her space, reading something on her phone. She looked up when Ava came out. Her expression asked the question without words. He's going to be all right, Ava said. Not today, but eventually. Okafor nodded. She fell into step beside her as they walked. At 11 a.m., the installation's public affairs officer, a major named Torres, called Okafor's phone and spoke to her for 12 minutes, while Ava sat nearby listening to one side of the conversation. When Okafor hung up, she turned to Ava with an expression of composed but genuine astonishment. The Secretary of the Army's office called, she said. They want a statement. Ava sat with that. What kind of statement? About the tournament. About your service. About, Okafor paused, reading from her own notes. About, and I'm quoting, the evolving role of women in special operations and the standards of conduct that represent the highest values of military service. That's a lot of ground, Ava said. That's Washington, Okafor said. They don't ask small questions. She put her phone down. Torres is also fielding 17 media requests, 2 network morning programs, a national newspaper, several independent outlets. She paused. And Private Graves has been contacted by someone he's not sure who wants to hear his version of events. Graves should tell the truth, Ava said immediately. The whole thing, exactly what he saw and heard. I'll tell him that, Okafor said. At 1 p.m., Ava found Graves in the same cafeteria where they'd talked that morning, which felt like 3 days ago. He was sitting with Specialist Kim, who Ava was meeting properly for the first time. Kim was 30 years old, compact, with the kind of direct eye contact that communicates both intelligence and a decision recently made and committed to. Thank you, Ava said to Kim, sitting across from them both, for coming forward. I know it wasn't easy. Private Graves said something to me, Kim said, about doing the right thing is so your daughter can see it. She shrugged, but the shrug wasn't casual. It was the shrug of someone being more honest than they're entirely comfortable with. I have a daughter, she's 7. I don't want her to grow up thinking her mother watched something wrong happen and stayed quiet because it was easier. What's her name? Ava asked. Kim looked slightly surprised by the question. Maya. Maya's going to be proud of her mother, Ava said, simply, without decoration. Kim looked at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright but controlled. I hear it's already everywhere, she said. 11 million Graves told me. Something like that, Ava said. Does that feel strange? Ava thought about it honestly. It feels like something I don't have a category for yet, she said. I keep trying to put it somewhere, and it doesn't fit in any of the places I have. Graves said, my grandfather called me this morning. He saw the video. He paused. His voice had changed slightly. He's 91 years old, and he called me from the nursing home in Wichita. And he said, that young woman fought like she had something worth fighting for. And then he said, make sure she knows someone from the old days was watching. Ava looked at him, thought about a 91-year-old man in Wichita who served in Korea watching a video on whatever device he had in a nursing home and calling his grandson to say that. Tell him thank you, she said. Tell him I'll take that with me. Graves nodded. He looked like he might say something else and then didn't and then did. Whatever happens next, whatever Caldwell is planning or the Army or any of it, I hope you know that what you did here already meant something. Before the 11 million, before the Secretary's office, when it was just 500 soldiers in a building in Texas. He paused. It meant something then. She looked at him for a long moment. 22 years old, 14 months in. His grandfather from Korea on the phone at 7 a.m. I know, she said quietly. That's the part I'm keeping. At 3 p.m., Hargrove's office released the official statement on the tournament incident. It was 2 paragraphs, precise. It confirmed the JAG finding, confirmed Reynolds' suspension, and stated that the actions of Petty Officer First Class Ava Carter were consistent with the highest standards of military conduct and competitive integrity. 2 paragraphs, plain language, but they moved through the online world in the next 3 hours like something on fire, attached to the video that now had 22 million views, and then 30, and then the number stopped, being something Ava was tracking, because it had moved beyond anything that felt connected to what had actually happened in that ring. At 5 p.m., she sat alone in the auxiliary training room. The broken air conditioning, the heat, the space where she had drilled that counter until it stopped being a thought. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her manila folder in her lap. She opened it, looked at the photographs of Reynolds different, now those photographs carrying the weight of everything that had happened since she'd studied them. Looked at the bracket sheets with their penciled notations. She looked at her father's face. He was 37. She was 6. They were both laughing at something the camera had caught mid-moment. She sat with him for a while. In the heat, in the quiet, she told him not out loud what had happened. She told him about the form being torn, about Webb's model of her, about Graves and Kim and the waves she'd let come and then redirected, about the sound she'd heard at the 4-minute mark, about sitting in Hargrove's office and telling the truth in plain language, about Reynolds in the hospital bed saying, "I don't know how to explain it in a way that sounds like anything other than what it was." She told him about 30 million people watching a video and a 91-year-old man in a nursing home in Wichita calling his grandson at 7 in the morning. She told him she'd done what he taught her to do. She'd breathed like she already knew. The folder sat in her lap. The heat settled around her. Outside, the installation was doing its evening things, soldiers moving vehicles, the sound of a daily routine that continues regardless of what extraordinary events have occurred within it, because that is what daily routines are built to do. She closed the folder carefully, put it back in the duffel bag. She stood up. She had a meeting with Caldwell tomorrow morning. That was not an offer and not a proposal, but that both of them knew was the beginning of something. She had a statement to give to the secretary's office. She had Graves, who needed guidance on how to tell his truth. She had Kim's daughter Maya, who would grow up knowing her mother had done the right thing. She had Reynolds in a hospital bed working through something hard and private that was none of her business, but that she hoped would end somewhere better than where it had started. She had all of it. She picked up her bag, put it over her shoulder, left the room. In the corridor outside, she checked her phone. There was a text from a number she didn't recognize, not Caldwell this time, but a Virginia area code. It read, "Petty Officer Carter, this is Senator Walsh's office. The senator would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding the Combat Standards Review currently before the Armed Services Committee. Please reply at your convenience." She stared at the phone for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket and kept walking. One thing at a time, she replied to the senator's office at 6 p.m. that evening. 3 sentences. She confirmed receipt indicated she was available to speak and asked that all communication go through her chain of command. Then she put the phone down and ate dinner alone and was asleep by 9. She slept without the creak of the mattress bothering her. She didn't notice it at all. At 5 a.m. she was up again. The same road, the same dark. But this time she didn't run to think or run to not think. She ran because it was what she did, because the rhythm of it was hers, because some things are worth keeping exactly as they are, regardless of what the world around them is doing. 4 miles, deliberate pace. The sky moving through its colors above her, while the installation below it was still quiet. When she came back in, there were 17 missed calls on her phone from numbers she didn't recognize and 3 texts from Okafor, the last of which read, "Don't talk to anyone before we meet. 7 a.m., my quarters. Don't be late." She wasn't late. Okapor's quarters were orderly in the specific way of someone who has lived out of a series of temporary spaces for so long that creating order has become less about preference and more about necessity. She had coffee ready. She had printed documents on the table. She had the expression of someone who had been up for at least 2 hours already and had used those hours productively. "Sit," she said. Ava sat. "The video is at 47 million views," Okafor said. "That happened overnight. 3 major network morning programs ran segments this morning. 2 of them led with it." She turned one of the printed pages around so Ava could see it. It was a headline, large font, a national newspaper. Ava read it and felt the same thing she'd felt the day before when Walsh said 11 million, the sensation of a number that is technically real, but experientially impossible to hold. "There's more," Okafor said. She turned another page. "Reynolds' suspension has been escalated. His chain of command received the JAG report and the witness statements at 0600 this morning. His commanding officer has opened a formal conduct review. That review will include not just the locker room statements, but his conduct in the registration tent 2 days ago, which was witnessed by enough people that the documentation is substantial." She paused. He is looking at a serious professional consequence, not just the suspension. What kind of consequence? Ava asked. Rank review, possibly separation proceedings. Okafor held her gaze. This is not something you caused. His conduct created the conditions. You just competed. I know, Ava said, and she did know. But knowing it didn't make the weight of it lighter, which was something she was learning to hold alongside knowing. Is he still in the medical facility? He's being transferred to the main post hospital this morning. The surgery last night was successful. He'll need several months of rehabilitation. Ava nodded. She thought about him staring at the ceiling in that room, about the moment his voice had lost its performance and gone somewhere rawer and more real. She thought about, I don't know how to explain it in a way that sounds like anything other than what it was. The senator's office. Okafor said, moving on with the particular efficiency of someone covering ground because the ground needs covering. I spoke to their staff contact at 6:30. Senator Walsh is on the Armed Services Committee and is specifically working on the Combat Integration Standards Review. It's been in committee for 14 months and has been stalled. What happened here has given it momentum. She paused. They want your testimony, not immediately, in 3 weeks in Washington, before the full committee. The room was very quiet. My testimony, Ava said. Your account of events, your experience as a female SEAL, your perspective on standards integration, what works and what doesn't. Okafor folded her hands. This is not an order. This is a request and it will come through official channels with your chain of command's involvement. But I want you to understand what it means before it arrives officially. She held Ava's gaze across the table. If you agree to testify, you are walking into a political arena. There are people on that committee who will support everything you represent. There are people on that committee who will try to dismantle you. She let that sit. It will be harder than anything you've done this week. Different hard, but harder. Ava looked at the printed pages on the table. The headline, the numbers. She thought about Caldwell and his program and his question about moral clarity under pressure. She thought about the choice she'd made in that registration tent and in the ring and outside Reynolds' hospital room door. She thought about the 1,000 small choices that add up to one large thing. If I don't testify, she said slowly, what happens to the review? It goes back to stalling, Okafor said. Probably for another year, maybe longer. And the women in the pipeline right now, the ones going through SEAL qualification, through Ranger School, through the other programs, they continue to operate in a system that hasn't formally addressed what happened to you in that registration tent 2 days ago, and what has been happening in registration tents like it for years. Okafor's voice was even. She was not pushing, she was informing. The distinction was one Ava felt clearly. That is the reality they return to, regardless of what you decide. Ava sat with it. 1 full minute of silence, which Okafor allowed completely. The coffee in her cup cooled. I'll testify, Ava said. Okafor didn't react with visible relief or satisfaction, which was one of the things about her that Ava had come to deeply respect. She simply nodded, once made a note, and moved to the next page. Caldwell, she said, 8 a.m. He knows about the senator's office. He'll have his own questions. At 8 a.m. Caldwell's meeting was not in Building C this time, but in a smaller room in a different administrative building that felt less official and therefore more serious in the specific way that informal settings can be more serious than formal ones, when the people in them have dropped the performance of officialdom. Walsh was there. The woman with the notepad was there. And there was a third person Ava hadn't seen before, a woman in Navy dress uniform, captain's insignia, who introduced herself as Captain Renee Holloway, and who had the contained authority of someone whose rank was the least interesting thing about her. She was the director of the program Caldwell had described obliquely the morning before. She was also, Ava learned in the first 5 minutes, the woman who had put Ava's name on the program's watch list 8 months ago, based on her performance evaluations, her deployment record, and a single paragraph written by her SEAL team commander that described her as, and Holloway quoted it from memory, the most complete operator I have worked alongside in 16 years of service, and the clearest moral thinker I have encountered in any context. Ava heard that and felt something move through her that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name accurately. Not pride exactly, not surprise. Something between them, the particular feeling of being seen fully and accurately by someone who had the standing to do the seeing. Why are you telling me this now? Ava asked. Because what happened this week changed the timeline, Holloway said. We were going to approach you in 4 months through proper channels with a formal program invitation. What happened here moved the conversation forward by necessity because you are no longer operating in a private context. You are operating in a public one. Her eyes were direct and steady. And in a public context, we want you to know who is in your corner before you walk into rooms where the corners matter. What does the program actually want from me? Ava asked. Specifically, Holloway didn't hesitate. We want you to continue being exactly what you already are, she said. We formalize it, we resource it, we connect you to a network of people operating at the same level with the same values, and we ask you when the time comes to take on assignments that go beyond standard operational scope. She paused. Assignments that require the specific combination of skill and judgment, and she chose the word deliberately, moral weight that your record demonstrates. Moral weight, Ava said. The ability to do the right thing when the cost of doing it is personal, Holloway said. Not just professionally, personally, the ability to absorb that cost and continue. She held Ava's gaze. You've done that 3 times this week alone. In the tent, in the ring, in Reynolds' hospital room this morning. Ava went still. You know about that. Fort Hardin is not a large installation, Caldwell said mildly from the corner of the room. She looked at them both, Holloway, Caldwell, Walsh, the woman with the notepad. She thought about walking into Reynolds' room because her father had taught her, you don't stop seeing someone's humanity just because they failed to see yours. She thought about whether she would have done that if she'd known someone was cataloging it as evidence of moral weight. She decided the answer was yes. She would have done it anyway, because that was the point. I want to read the program details before I formally agree to anything, she said. Of course, Holloway said. She passed a folder across the table. Classified cover. Take the time you need. The meeting ended at 9:30. Ava walked out with more in her hands than she'd walked in with in every sense. She stood in the corridor for a moment, feeling the weight of the folder, and thought about a girl in Arizona who had been 9 years old and terrified of a competition, and whose father had knelt beside her and said, breathe like you already won. That girl could not have imagined this corridor, this folder, this weight, but she would have recognized the breathing. At 11 a.m. Graves found her. He always seemed to find her, which she had stopped being surprised by. He had the persistent, earnest quality of someone who operates on instinct rather than calculation. He went where he was drawn, and he had been drawn into Ava Carter's orbit since the moment he'd watched her walk out of the registration tent with the pieces of her torn form. They want me on television, he said. He looked like a man for whom this fact was physically uncomfortable. One of the morning programs, they reached out through the installation's PO. Major Torres said, it's my decision. What do you want to do? She asked. I don't know. He was honest about it, which she appreciated. I'm not someone who does that. I'm from Wichita. I work in logistics. I'm not a story. You're not, she agreed. You're a witness. There's a difference. He looked at her. What would you do? She thought about it seriously. I'd think about what telling the truth in that context accomplishes, not for me, for the thing the truth is about. She paused. The Senate review, the women in the pipeline, the people who are going to have to walk into registration tents after this, in installations that aren't being watched by anyone from the Pentagon. She let him sit with that. What happened in that locker room needs to be on the record. Not just the JAG record, the public record. Because the JAG record closes, the public record stays open. I was quiet for a long moment. My grandfather, he said finally, called again this morning. He saw the news segments. He stopped. He was crying. He said it plainly without embarrassment. He's 91 years old and he was crying. He said he spent 60 years thinking certain things would never change. And he was watching the news this morning and he thought maybe they could. Ava looked at him, at his 22-year-old face carrying the weight of a 91-year-old man's tears and 6 decades of waiting for things to change. Tell the truth, she said. Exactly what you saw, exactly what you heard. Nothing more, nothing less. And do it for your grandfather. He nodded, straightened. Okay, a pause. Thank you for... He gestured vaguely, encompassing the past 3 days, the registration tent, the cafeteria table at 6 a.m., all of it. for making it mean something. You made it mean something, she said. You showed up and told the truth when it was easier not to. That's yours. He left. She watched him go and thought that he was going to be extraordinary. Not this year, maybe not for several years, but eventually. He had the thing that couldn't be trained, the instinct toward the right thing, even when the right thing was inconvenient, impersonal, and cost you something. He had it the way some people have perfect pitch, not learned, but present, waiting to be used. At 2 p.m., she went back to the auxiliary training room one last time. The heat, the silence, the space where she drilled herself down to reflex. She didn't train, she just stood in the middle of it and breathed and let the past 3 days exist all at once inside her, the registration tent. The first match, the second match. Okapor's coffee graves at the breakfast table. Reynolds' voice in the ring saying last chance, the sound she'd heard at 4 minutes. The stillness of 500 people. Reynolds in the hospital bed finding words for something he'd never had to put into words before Holloway's folder. Her father's face in the photograph, the 91-year-old man in Wichita crying in front of the morning news. She let all of it be there. She didn't organize it or resolve it. She just let it exist, which was something she'd learned was the only honest thing to do, with experiences that were larger than your current ability to understand them. You let them be there. You breathed through them. You trusted that the understanding would come in its own time. At 3 p.m., Colonel Hargrove called her to his office. She went alone. I was standing when she came in. He did not sit down for the entire meeting, which lasted 11 minutes, which told her the meeting was going to be direct. I've been running this tournament for 7 years, he said. I've seen good fighters and great fighters, and once or twice someone who was in a different category from all of it. Someone who made everyone in the room better just by being in it, not by winning, but by how they competed. He held her gaze. I want you to know that what happened here this week will be reflected in how I structure this tournament going forward. In the standards, we apply the conduct, protocols, the oversight. Those things are changing because of this week. I appreciate that, sir. I also want you to know, he said, and his voice shifted slightly, that I should have intervened in the registration tent. When Reynolds, he stopped, started again. I was informed of the incident within 20 minutes. I did not respond quickly enough, and that is on me. Ava looked at him. 60 years old, 38 years of service, the kind of face that shows its history honestly. What would you have done differently, she asked. Acted faster, he said simply. Not waited for the formal structure to catch up to what I already knew was wrong. He held her gaze. That's the lesson I'm taking out of this week. She nodded. Then it helps something, she said. That matters. He almost smiled. The same almost smile as Caldwell, the kind that men of a certain generation and experience produce when they are moved by something and have not entirely decided whether to let it show. You are going to do significant things, he said. I think you know that. I'm going to try to do the right things, she said. The significance takes care of itself. He put out his hand. She shook it. He held the handshake for a moment longer than a formal handshake requires, which was his way of saying something he didn't have words for, and she received it as such. She left his office at 3:11 p.m. At 4 p.m. her phone rang. Virginia area code, not the senator's office this time, but a different number, she answered. The voice on the other end was a woman, slightly older professional, but not cold. She identified herself as a staff director for the Armed Services Committee and explained that the committee's chair had personally reviewed the JAG report that morning and had accelerated the timeline on the Combat Integration Standards Review. The hearing, originally scheduled for 3 weeks out, was being moved to 10 days. They want you first on the witness list, the woman said. Ava sat down on the edge of her bunk. First, she repeated. The chair believes that the foundation of the review should be established by testimony from someone currently serving in an active special operations role, someone who can speak to the reality of what integration looks like at the operational level. A pause. That's you, Petty Officer Carter. She sat with the phone against her ear and the afternoon light coming through the window and the installation sounds outside and the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing gently and firmly against the inside of her chest. I'll be there, she said. She put the phone down, sat in the quiet for a moment. Then she opened the duffel bag and took out the manila folder for the last time. She looked at the photographs of Reynolds. They were different again, now changed for the third time by everything that had happened since she'd first studied them. She removed them from the folder and set them aside. She looked at the bracket sheets, the penciled notations. She set those aside too. She was left with a photograph of her father, 37 years old. She was 6. They were both laughing. She held it in both hands and looked at him for a long time. She thought about everything she'd done in the past 3 days, and she went through it honestly the way he would have wanted her to, not performing modesty, not performing pride, but honestly. Had she done right? Had she done what she was capable of? Had she breathed like she already knew, even when she didn't know, even when the knowing was hard? She thought she had, not perfectly, not without cost, but honestly and with everything she had, which was all any person could ever bring to the moments that mattered. I'll keep going, she told the photograph, not out loud, but fully. She put it carefully back in the folder. At 5 p.m., she packed her duffel bag. She had a transport leaving at 0600 tomorrow morning, returning her to her unit, and then in 10 days she had Washington. She folded her clothes with the methodical attention of someone for whom the care of small tasks is connected to the care of large ones. She checked her equipment. She cleaned her boots, which did not strictly need cleaning, but which was something her father had taught her. You take care of the things that carry you. At 6 p.m., she went to find Okafor. She found her in the corridor outside the administrative building, standing alone, watching the sky do its evening work. Okafor had the posture of someone not trying to carry everything for just a few minutes, which is a posture that 28 years in the Army teaches you to take whenever the opportunity presents itself, because the opportunities are rarer than they should be. Ava stood beside her. They were quiet together for a moment. Washington in 10 days, Ava said. I'll be there, Okafor said, without being asked, without any qualification. Ava looked at her. You don't have to. Carter. Okafor turned slightly. Her voice was what it always was, not soft, not hard, but real, carrying the full weight of the person saying it. 28 years ago, I walked into a recruiting office in Cleveland, Ohio, and a sergeant behind the desk looked at me and said, You sure about this, honey? He said it the same way Reynolds said what he said in that tent. The same confidence, the same absolute certainty that he already knew the answer. She paused. Nobody was watching when he said it. There was no JAG review. There were no Pentagon observers. There were no 11 million people. She held Ava's gaze. I kept going anyway, and I kept going, and I got to 28 years. And then I got to this week. And I got to watch you do in 3 days what I have been trying to do in 3 decades. Her voice did not break, but it came close. So yes, I will be in Washington. Because somebody should have been in that recruiting office in Cleveland, and I am not going to miss the chance to be in the room when it matters. Ava looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the 1,000 small choices that add up to one large thing. She thought about Okafor making those choices alone for 28 years in rooms where nobody was watching. She thought about what it costs to keep going when the going is only yours and the keeping of it has no audience and no reward except the integrity of the keeping itself. Thank you, she said. It was not enough. It was the only thing. Don't thank me, Okafor said. She almost smiled. Breathe like you already know. She had heard Ava say it. She had been listening all along to everything. At 7 p.m., Graves texted her. It said, confirm the interview morning program. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. My hands are shaking, but I'm doing it. Then a second text immediately after. My grandfather said to tell you, some people run toward the fire. Those are the ones worth watching. She smiled. Actually smiled full and real, the kind that comes without deciding to. She typed back, tell him thank you. Tell him we're just getting started. She put the phone down, picked up the duffel bag, settled it on her shoulder left side, same as always. She had a transport at 0600. She had Washington in 10 days. She had a folder with her father's face in it, in a classified program document she had not yet read, in a chain of command that was behind her, and a 22-year-old from Wichita whose hands were shaking, but who was going to sit in front of a camera at 7 a.m. and tell the truth anyway, and a woman in Cleveland who had kept going for 28 years in rooms where nobody was watching, so that this room this week, this moment could exist. She had all of it. She walked down the corridor, through the door, out into the Texas evening, and she didn't look back. Not because she was leaving it behind, but because everything worth carrying was already with her. 3 days ago, a man put his boot on her name and told her she didn't belong. He said it with everything he had, his size, his record, his absolute certainty, 500 witnesses in the full weight of every assumption that had been allowed to stand unchallenged for far too long. She had answered him the only way that ever actually answers that question. She had shown up. She had competed. She had let the outcome speak. And the outcome had traveled 47 million times around a world that was paying attention, carrying with it one simple, undeniable, permanent truth, that the woman who had walked into that registration tent with a duffel bag and a torn form and 4 quiet words had not been there to prove anything to anyone. She had simply been there because she belonged there. And nothing, not a boot on her name, not a torn form, not 230 pounds of certainty, not the history of every room that had ever said otherwise, nothing had ever been able to make that less true. That was the whole story, and it was enough.